Hello, everyone. This is Carter Wetzel with another episode of Into the Interchain, and today we have Christian, one of the lead developers of Shade Protocol, one of the head architects of Shade Land. A lot of this protocol's success is on the back of Christian, and we have the honor of having him on today to be able to talk about Land, to be able to talk about Silk in depth. So, Christian, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Pretty good. Glad to be here. I'm excited to talk about this stuff. I'm always excited to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. So for a lot of people out there, like lending is one of the key primitives in crypto. So I'd love for you to kind of walk through in your mind the history of lending protocols in crypto. What have been some of their greatest successes and some of their greatest failures?
Yeah, sure. Lending in crypto obviously has its roots in traditional finance, right? The concept of lending in general is that I have something that I'm not using right now that has value, and I want something else that has value, but I don't want to get rid of what I have right now.
Mm,
So this thing that I have right now is collateral to borrow something else. That's just like a super basic, dumbed down thing of what lending is. And so in the real world, obviously, the way that works is there's some level of enforcement. Generally it's legal. So if you don't pay your loan, someone will come back and repossess things that you have. It'll hit your credit score, etc. So crypto is really nice because this is actually one of the major applications of crypto that is totally unique to crypto, which is smart contracts. You can actually write a contract that codifies the terms of the loan and without any third party enforcement, make sure that the loan is fair. So I put up my collateral, I get a loan, and if I don't pay that loan, I lose my collateral, and the person who gave the loan isn't out any money. In
right.
fact, they're actually up money a little bit. So totally novel. No middleman, which obviously makes the loans cheaper to service as well because you don't have this third party that has to service the loan, and it's just overall so much better. So um, DeFi in general is pretty young, which means that lending in crypto is also pretty young, and we've seen a few different models come and go. There's the classic money market where you can. This is like Aave or something where you would deposit a blue chip, Bitcoin, ETH, something like that, borrow something else, USDT, more BTC, more ETH, whatever you want. The other model that's really common is the collateralized debt position backed stablecoins. This is MakerDAO, this is Abracadabra, this is ShadeLend. Same concept. There is a list of collateral that we accept. You can deposit that collateral and then you can take out a loan of Silk. In this case, the Silk is minted out of thin air. And when the loan is repaid, that Silk is burnt. And the Silk is backed entirely by that collateral. So the power here is that you essentially always get a token out of that it has some stable value, and it's a really innovative way to keep the peg as well. So this is mostly done with dollar stablecoins, and so something like DAI, for example, they will treat DAI as $1 in their contracts, no matter what the market price is.
Mm,
So if you have a market price that's $1.05, you borrow, or you can borrow at a dollar, sell it for $1.05. That's free money. People take it, and the price goes back down. Same in reverse. If you have a loan, uh, and the DAI is trading at 95 cents, you can buy the cheap DAI, repay your loan, and the contract will treat that as a dollar. So you just made 5% for free again, and that keeps the price nice and stable. So that mechanism is really interesting for Silk because that allows us to make sure that Silk maintains its peg, whatever its peg is, because there's natural market forces that do it. And at the same time, we provide a lending product. So people have collateral, they want to do stuff with it, but they don't want to sell it. Put it up as collateral and mint Silk. So it's a really innovative combination of principles, I
right.
think, that is really restricted to crypto.
So there's obviously the stable coins. There's been various models that have emerged over the year, and obviously over collateralization is really just like it's a lending product, and the medium of exchange tied to the lending product is the stable coin, right? So one of the common criticisms of over collateralization is capital efficiency. How like $150 of the collateral to mint out, $1 worth of stable coin to keep it simple. I know historically you've had a kind of a different view tied to capital efficiency. So I'd love to get your opinion on that. And I also have some risks I want to bring up too, but just kind of diving into your mindset of what it means for a stable coin like Silk to expand, safely over time, and what does efficiency actually mean,
Yeah, I think this is actually a pretty deep topic. The idea that over collateralized lending is less capital efficient is true, right? Like capital efficiency of a loan is literally defined by loan to value ratios.
Right.
And the less collateral you have to put up to borrow a given amount of money, the more capital efficient that loan is by definition. So that's totally accurate. And I think the way that impacts Lend, in isolation of Silk, any lending protocol, is that people will be less interested in taking out a loan if they have to put up more collateral. So that's it's a demand modifier, if you will.
Right.
If I set the LTV, the maximum LTV higher, there's more demand for that loan. The reason why I don't feel that it impacts the growth of Silk is because the actual growth mechanisms, like the way contraction and expansion works for Silk, actually has nothing to do with Lend itself. It's purely a function of supply and demand of Silk. So there is some known supply of Silk, right? And then there's going to be demand for that. That liquidity providers are going to provide liquidity to capitalize on, right? So if there is enough liquidity that the price of Silk is stable, and that means that it's at its peg, and the buy and trade volume is roughly equal on both sides, it doesn't matter about the capital efficiency of Lend because the supply and demand of Silk is equalized. And then if you enter a situation where, like I said, where DAI goes to $1.05 when it's supposed to be $1, same for Silk. If Silk is supposed to be $1.05 and it's $1.10, that is literally free money for people to go and you can take out a loan and immediately get money right away.
Right.
So with enough market participants and with enough variety of collateral, there will be someone somewhere who will take that money and drive the price down. And we have the same sort of free money mechanism to protect against downward depegs, which is a pretty common thing that other collateralized stablecoins struggle with, particularly at low market caps, because the demand to repay your loan is generally considerably less than the demand to take out a loan and get money right away.
Yep.
So we have a couple mechanisms that allow the peg to go back up to the normal value, whether or not there's demand for repaying those loans. So because the lending mechanism does help keep the price stable, but if there is insufficient supply to meet demand, that supply will be created by somebody, just because why not? It's instant money.
One of the risks I've been thinking about recently is, so picture this scenario. Let's say we're talking about ETH, all right, and there's just so much. Let's say, and obviously, the answer here is to have more than one collateral, but I'm just gonna walk through this thought experiment so as to expose a certain risk. Silk's extremely demanded, right? More and more, Silk is being purchased, and people keep putting up more and more ETH collateral, like Arbors are, in order to handle the demand on Silk. And eventually, let's say 51% of the supply of ETH is locked up. It's total supply, and it's backing all the Silk. If essentially what I'm worried about is when you get to a really large scale, when there's not enough liquidity on the market to handle the liquidations. That's the fear in my mind is ultimately Silk stability is not dependent on the collective value of collateral. It's backed by the collective available liquidity. And that's a scary limitation because it's a very real limitation. It's one that can't be sidestepped, if that makes sense. So how do you bound that? How do you handle that? Because you could have a situation where the demand for Silk is outstripping the liquidity, and then you'd be above peg, and there actually wouldn't be enough available collateral in relation to sufficient liquidity. Does that thought experiment make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, and it's something that I thought about as well. This is kind of a tangent, but the way that you phrased it when you said the value of the collateral doesn't there's not enough liquidity in order to liquidate that given value of collateral. And I think that's just an interesting way to describe value because I mean, it is literally the on paper value. It's the price of the token times the number of tokens you have. But the real value, actually, if you pay your taxes with stocks and stuff, this is also how they value equities and things like that. It's about how it's about liquidity. The fair market value actually is dependent on liquidity and doesn't really have anything to do with the market cap. Um, so in that sense, as long as we are good about parameterizing our loans with liquidity in mind, then we'll be okay. The thing that gets a little tricky, especially with ETH, right, is that liquidity is fragmented. So there's going to be an amount of liquidity here on Secret Network, and there's going to be an amount of liquidity elsewhere in the entire crypto space, right? So I generally consider those types of liquidity different because there is some amount of ETH that we can liquidate right now on chain, and that's a very fast, very efficient, very desirable
Yep.
form of liquidation. But in an extreme event where, let's say, we have to contract very heavily, like ETH just tanks 20%, and there's just not enough liquidity available on the chain to absorb that.
This
Um,
was like what happened with Solana, right? That's essentially what
yep,
happened. Yep.
yep. But in this case, the liquidators are still, they're going to get regular old ETH or SNP 20 wrapped ETH. So there will be some amount of people who will be able to liquidate instantly on chain. And once that's exhausted, your only option would be to take that money, bridge it elsewhere, and sell it elsewhere.
Right.
So as a liquidator, there is still some amount of protection. Um, but really, the real answer pretty much is uh, the tokens or the loans have to be parameterized with liquidity in mind,
Right.
which is actually it's basically a bit like Luna, like the whole Luna
Yep.
UST thing.
Yep.
There was market cap and then there was liquidity, and they're very different numbers.
Yep. It's just one of those
So
things
as
where
long
like
as
over collateralized stablecoins are always talked about as like they're very safe mechanisms, and I think generally the reason it's kind of a sneaky reason why they really haven't broken it. And my sneaky suspicion is that demand for the stablecoin scales with the available liquidity. And that's why
Mhm.
you rarely encounter a circumstance where there's a very large mismatch between demand and liquidity. Because the lucrativeness of the loan, the utility of the loan is based off of the depth of liquidity. So that's been kind
Exactly.
of like my free market theory about like why this problem hasn't occurred. But I still think it would be possible for a scenario where like but you'd have to gobble up the world, right? It would be like there's so much demand for silk that like you have like all these digital assets getting sucked up and there's just like literally not enough value capable of matching the silk. And under that circumstance, you'd have to have some form of like negative interest rates to reduce demand. And anyways, it's point of the conversation just fun to like really go in depth and like kind of dig into what are the risks of over collateralization. This is clearly an edge case, but it's it's like good for the community to be aware of like the greatest risk of silk is tied to its available liquidity, and that's like when we're parameterizing loans and these vaults, that like that is the thing we're very obsessed with. And actually this actually makes sense that like owning your own dex in this scenario is like super helpful for this type of problem in many ways because we get to place incentives to help deepen liquidity that's ultimately helping back stability of everything. So
It's actually a really interesting thought experiment the more I think about it, just because as far as I can tell, this scenario really only happens if the demand for silk grows so rapidly and so large. I'm talking like, 400, 500, 600 billion dollars of silk market cap. Like the amount of market cap for silk is so large that the literal entire crypto space isn't keeping up, which if we're in that situation, number one, that's kind of a good problem, but also the problem that you're identifying is very real. And it's like, what do we do about that? Literally, the entire crypto space is not keeping up with us. And honestly, I feel like we'd have to explore some other ways of collateralizing the coin just because they like if we can't offer enough collateral just because there's not enough liquidity and there's still demand for silk, how does the silk enter circulation? You know, I don't know the answer to that.
yeah,
That's a really tough one.
yeah. It makes me think that like part of protocol on liquidity becomes this promise of like exit liquidity for the stablecoin in many ways. That's one thing I've been thinking about. Like, and so you you like, and this is within the context of like a stable swap, right? But you could hypothetically like convert revenue into continuing to build out the depth of like actual protocol and liquidity that's not going to run, that represents stable value, and that becomes like a floor. But there's always going to be a gap between that floor and like what's actually in circulation. So I don't know, it's just interesting thoughts. And I think there's got to be something in there with like negative interest rates, plus I don't even know how bonds will like play into this. Like bonds are this really interesting equation. The protocol and liquidity with the stable swap and the DEX, like there's so many tools in play here. And it's just interesting to think about the combinations and the options.
Yeah, maybe looking at Frax is probably the closest thing. Because don't they have the AMOs where they can
Yep.
mint Frax
Yep.
into a liquidity pool? So I mean, something like that certainly, if it's properly bounded and all that, that's another expansion option if we find truly that Lend is unable to meet the demand for Silk. But
Yep.
I actually think that's
Technically, like the Luna situation, like that's technically the scenario that played out. The problem is that they didn't have any like it's played out on the collateralization was only like a single collateral, and they allowed the free creation of liabilities at any collateral price point. Like, right, there's like clearly like some very obvious risk, but that is how that scenario plays out when it's like there's literally not enough liquidity in relation to the amount of liabilities at play. Like it's just, it doesn't work. It breaks. Eventually it breaks. So I think with Silk, like I think it'll be really cool to keep challenging ourselves on some of these over collateralized risks, because if we're trying to make Silk a blue chip 10 years from now, it's good to begin having the tools in place to solve for this. And I don't know how a negative interest rates would work. It's essentially like people are losing money for holding Silk. They need to turn their Silk back in. It's like reducing demand for it. That would be a mechanism that could be introduced. And like, what a ludicrous mechanism. Like, when would you need that? Well, you need in the scenario where this situation where demand outstrips available liquidity.
Well, yeah. It would be negative interest rates from a bonds perspective, but it would be positive interest rates from a lend perspective. So actually, maybe if we encountered this scenario where the supply of Silk was so great that we literally could not collateralize it on chain, just raising the interest rates to capitalize on that excess demand is one way of doing it, and upping the borrowing fee as well. Like, fine, if you really want Silk that bad, how much are you willing to pay? It also forced some contraction, because expansion by itself is obviously, it's not good by itself. It has to be bounded in some sense, and that's what our interest rates allow us to do. So.
Also, you're right. So positive interest, that's right. So increasing interest rates reduces demand. I was trying to think. Oh, so what's the maybe I guess negative interest rates is the inverse. It's like paying people to take out a loan in essence. So that would be paying people to increase supply. Technically, that would be interesting. I feel like Vitalik had a really interesting white paper where he mentioned the need for negative interest rates on stablecoins. I got to rehunt that down. That was like the kind of requeried the thought. He wasn't talking about it on the basis of this type of edge case, but he had theorized it as potentially a necessary mechanism.
Yeah, I think the way it breaks down eventually, like into first principles, it all comes down to the collateralization of the token, or the ratio of assets to liabilities. Whether you have negative interest rates, in that sense you're decollateralizing your token because that money's coming from somewhere. Whether you're offering bonds with positive interest rates, which again is decollateralizing your token because you're inflating it. Whether you go with the Frax model, which is by putting tokens into a pool and allowing people to purchase them at a cheaper price than the pool would allow it to, again, decollateralizes your coin. So all of these things ultimately come down to how much of a fractional reserve are you willing to have for your currency. Which, I think that ventures a little bit into fiat territory, so I'm a little cautious about it. But
interesting.
I kind of reduce everything to looking at based on the collateralization, because that is the ratio of assets to liabilities, and that's what we want to protect ultimately.
Right.
So.
Right. Interesting. Well, that was a deep dive on some of the risks of, I guess, Silk at scale. As we approach the launch of Silk, what's keeping you up at night? What's the key sequence that needs to happen such a like a month in, you're like, yep, like we're okay. Like right now, we can take a deep breath. Like it looks like we're in a pretty stable spot with the market. What does that look like in your mind with depth of liquidity, and usage?
The hardest thing definitely is like the first 24 hours, or even like really the first hour. How do you go from 0 to 1? That's a pretty difficult challenge because you need people who are willing to take out loans of Silk, who will simply hold Silk, or someone who has a good amount of money, or lots of people who have a good amount of money who are willing to take out those loans and liquidity provide. And I see the utility there because it's a stable coin pool. You're not going to be exposed to impermanent loss. It's a very low volatility position. Because it's a stable coin pool, there's generally going to be very good trade volume on it, which means good fees. We can also have low interest rates and low fees to make those loans attractive in the initial bootstrapping phase. But basically, there's some sequence of events that has to happen, probably with coordination of partners and stuff, and rolling out that initial liquidity, rolling out those initial loans, bootstrapping the stability pool so that we have some Silk available to execute those liquidations because prices are going to fluctuate no matter what. And we need to make sure that we have some in there to handle that volatility. And that's probably it. So in terms of how we get there, like I said, with the partners and anyone else who's willing to take out a loan and hold Silk for a couple of days while we stabilize, and then working toward getting, I would be happy with $1 million in every stablecoin pool.
Yep.
And that number mostly just feels good. $1 million is nice and round, but it's also it's deep enough because we have a stable swap curve. You can trade some pretty large amounts in that pool with very good capital efficiency. So most people will be able to actually use their Silk at that case. In that case, and at that point, I feel pretty comfortable with the natural expansion of Silk at that point. Just more partnerships, more integrations, more collateral, more primitives on Shade Protocol, all of which creating natural utility, which, we have that baseline liquidity. And
I do think it's super interesting that, like, because Silk is going to be this base pair on the DEX, it's such nice confluence because it's like you mint Silk and it's immediately like, well, I have all these options to route through. Like, we're essentially inheriting all the liquidity of the DEX versus like if you're some other stablecoin and you don't have like an intimate relationship with the DEX, you essentially have to like go incentivize a specific pool, and then it's like you're routing through just that pool to other pairs as opposed to being the base pair. So I think like I've never seen a DEX where they own their own stablecoin. Curve's headed in that direction, but like I think it's actually such a unique situation where it really bootstraps the utility a lot faster, and it should bootstrap kind of that base liquidity too. Which I think is a nice little advantage to have on our end, because it's like, why if there's no Silk pools anywhere, why mint out Silk? Well, just to hold it, right? Well, why Silk's actually uniquely differentiated because you would still maybe want to do that because it's like, well, Silk's potentially like appreciating in value faster than like my interest rate. Like there's some like really weird, interesting relationships between interest fees and Silk appreciating versus your sovereign currency that you're thinking about, right? But separate from that utility, which is already differentiated, there's going to be utility waiting for people on the other end right away, which I think is going to be very helpful, very helpful.
Right. It's really just the orchestration of that in the first, like when the contracts go out, how we literally get from 0 to 1 carefully in a way that makes sense. But then beyond that, I feel totally confident that the flywheel will take over. It'll be very natural.
Yep. So
that's the goal, right?
We've talked about the kind of the sequencing, that it has to be done carefully, it has to be done right. But if we can just kind of get that foot in the door, that it should go well. That's the short term. Talk about the long term. Talk me through like the available vaults out of the gates and how do we? I know Oracle is obviously the answer for this, but like how rapid will the vault options expand, and like what's kind of your thought process behind, the different vaults that are used?
Yeah, so the thought process behind the vaults, basically there's two primary drivers. There's what vaults do we want to offer that people want? So this is like what people have that they want to borrow against. And also what assets do we want to accept as backing for Silk? And a good vault satisfies both of those constraints very well. It's a vault that people will actually use, and it's a vault that contains a currency that we are happy using as collateral for Silk. So um, out of the gate, we want to keep it simple with blue chips, Secret, ETH, Bitcoin maybe. Our only option on Secret is Wrap Bitcoin, which I personally don't feel too great about. And although the sentiment on Wrap Bitcoin has kind of quieted down a little bit, but
Yep.
definitely Secret, definitely ETH, probably a stable coin of some kind in there. Uh,
Osmo maybe.
Osmo, yeah, Osmo, IBC assets, those things are pretty safe. So Osmo Atom, no problem with that. It's all pretty straightforward. Those are all tokens people probably want to use as collateral, and they're all reasonably strong.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And so that'd be like the first phase, basic, just tokens, straight up tokens. And then the second phase, we'd want to roll out LP tokens. So this would be you could deposit tokens in Shadeswap as a liquidity provider, earn yield on that position, and then use that yield bearing position to take out a loan as well. And some of those LPs will probably do, again, blue chip stuff like a USDC, USDT LP, probably a lot of all the Silk stablecoin LPs, which maybe that sounds a little self-referential because Silk is backing Silk. But the way the math works out, because that Silk is contained in a contract, there is a pretty large amount of Silk that can come into supply backed by LPs that contain Silk. Like the fact that you can't move that money out of the contract unless you repay your loan,
Right.
helps it make more
You're
sense.
essentially
It's
creating
pretty complicated.
You're creating your own exit liquidity for your own loan, but you still
Yeah.
can't. You can't like magically move away that liquidity without paying back the Silk in the first place. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and the only way that Silk actually enters the market is if it's purchased, which drives the price up. Which is so the supply only ever really increases when the demand is increasing. So it's a pretty natural system. It gets pretty mathy beyond there, but it does work out as long as it's bounded. And in those positions as well, we'd like to also allow you to earn your staking yield. So if there are emissions on the pool, not only are you going to earn the trading fees because the token itself is yield bearing, but the collateral contract will also deposit your money into the staking contract, so you get those staking rewards as well.
You don't have to give up one. You don't have to give up one to do the other.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah,
And
that
that's
would
a
be the
first,
second
right?
phase.
That's pretty. It's maybe been done once or twice before, but it's pretty cutting edge to be able to do that, right?
Yeah, the way that we're doing it is definitely a first because of the unique interaction between lend and swap. Like we own all the contracts, so we can have a pretty direct interface there. The closest thing is probably, Sushi has their lending engine and Abracadabra has the degen box. That's similar. It basically achieves the same thing, but the implementation's pretty different.
Yep.
But
Probably
yeah,
simpler.
so
This
that
is
would be
probably the simpler implementation, I would imagine. I'd imagine they got to do a little more magic to pull that off.
Yeah, like the UST degen box was what Abracadabra was known for. Like that was actually pretty sketchy. I mean, there's off-chain stuff that's happening there in order to bridge the money, and yeah, we don't do any of that. It's totally non-custodial. There's none of that off-chain infrastructure that allows that collateralized loan to also be yield-bearing, which is really nice. So that definitely is the first.
So, MIM's a really interesting stablecoin because it pretty much is the degen. Like if there was like the cousins, the uncles or whatever, like MIM's the crazy one off in the distance. That's like, oh, that's Uncle Mim, like climbing Everest and skydiving. So like MIM hasn't seen. It's really ticked down and leveled off. It's been pretty quiet on the MIM adoption. So is that is that part of one of the risks of going more degen routes on Lend as you just maybe establish volatility reputationally tied to the stablecoin, or like where did MIM misstep? Was it largely the UST? Was it branding? I don't know. That's one of the things that I was just considering.
That's an interesting question. I think a lot of people would point to the brand. Magic Internet Money, go to abracadabra.money and cast a spell to mint Magic Internet Money. It sounds a little childish, but somehow they still hit whatever 2 billion at their peak. So maybe the branding isn't great, but it seems to have been okay. I would attribute the problems with MIM to just be utility. I mean, why hold MIM? Why use MIM? What's the point? Um, their real the only real differentiating factor that I see is that they have a huge list of tokens to use as collateral. So there's a lot of tokens that you can only borrow MIM against, or you can only use you can only borrow MIM with. You can't go to like MakerDAO and,
Right.
and borrow with certain tokens. So that's one thing. And it has deep enough liquidity that people seem to uh, be okay taking out those loans and just immediately selling them in. And there are enough market participants to help keep the price stable. But I feel like that's kind of why they've tapered. They just need more reason for people to use MIM, and I guess that goes back to branding. If you had to choose between, you know, Silk with our brand and our image and Magic Internet Money, and you're not making a brand that aligns with Abracadabra, you probably choose Silk or Dai or Frax or another
Yeah.
competitor. So yeah, it's complicated. But I would put it back to utility. Everything always comes back to utility for a
Yep.
stablecoin. People have to use it. That's where the value comes from.
And yeah, I suppose Silk's in a really nice spot because there's the privacy crowd that understands the utility of a stablecoin with privacy, and then it has the differentiation from dollar stablecoins, and it has the differentiation because it has that intimate relationship with the other primitives. Beyond that, it really
Mhm.
is just a race to the bottom on deeper liquidity equals utility. For being honest, in many like if you go to Ethereum, Dai versus Frax versus Mim, it's like they're all transparent, they're all pegged to the same thing. So what differentiates them? It's like depth of liquidity or offerings in terms of
Mhm.
lending options. So it's interesting to see like there's innovations, but then it always kind of boils down back to some basic attributes. But we've done a really good job, I think, of like A, bringing a new attribute to the table, and B, bringing a new design system to the stablecoin's inception. We'll see how far that takes us. We'll see.
Yeah, and I think it'll take us pretty far because we're not doing something that feels kind of weird like consumer price index, which I like. I get the idea of that, but a token pegged to the consumer price index, I think for the average person doesn't really feel like money. It feels like an index-based asset, which it is, but a stable coin that is trying to maintain low volatility
Yep.
pegged to an index of foreign currencies feels a lot more like money to people. So like the narrative there is really nice. And it also breaks us away from the dollar crowd, which is a differentiator.
I was also say like those flat coins. My one criticism of them is the rate of appreciation is essentially charged against the original minters, right?
Mm.
Because like it's like as the value of their loan, it as the value of their it's like the value of their loan, their loans increasing in size, and that's being charged against the collateral that they locked up. So Silk has a similar effect, but it's a much weaker effect because it's not trying to track inflation. That's not its goal. Its goal is to be volatility minimization between global currencies with purchasing power retention. It's trying to do a little bit of both, and it's kind of finding that equilibrium. It's not purely devoted to just like this tool is offsetting your inflation collectively, all that stuff. It's like that's a very lofty goal, and someone has to pay the cost of that inflation, and ultimately it's the collateral backing it. So
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. The whole inflation hedge. I mean, this the search for a true inflation hedge has been something that has been explored in finance for probably like pre-academia, honestly, ever since money was created. And I think it's an interesting problem because inflation fundamentally is like the creation of or just like growth of the economy everywhere. And so fundamentally, what would an inflation hedge have to be in order to really work with that? It would have to take a little bit of growth from everywhere.
yep,
Like it would have to be the beneficiary of every form of growth that's always happening in order to actually hedge against inflation. And that's kind of what Silk is, just
yep,
on a global scale. So
yeah. Ranger kind of described it as like it'd be like if one thing that's really unique. It'd be like if you could hold a dollar that was 95% dollars and 5% S&P 500, right?
mhm,
Most people would actually prefer to hold that because that would like it's essentially like part of your money is being productive, right? Like conceptually,
right.
and I like silks in a similar sense. Those commodities, in a way, are being productive, like for your currency that you're holding. And it's just a very weird concept that like money doesn't work for you. But imagine if you can make a money that's largely money, but with just a little bit of productivity involved in there, and then like what can that do for offsetting against inflation?
Mhm.
It's a very fascinating line to find. and and like Ranger had a quote that kind of blew my mind. I said, if Silk had sufficient liquidity, and based off of, because he was doing Sharpe ratios, he was doing all the backwards analysis, I was like, is this a better currency than the US dollar? And Ranger, very pessimistic person, very like he's gonna always punch holes, and he was like, yes, I would rather hold Silk. He's like, I've talked with like my other finance folks, and like they're like, it sounds too good to be true. And it's like, if the liquidity gets there and the promise of its attributes are true, like I genuinely believe this is the best currency that's ever been created. And that's like the gutsiest, ballsiest claim to make, and we'll see how the cards play.
Yeah, and I think it has a very interesting place in the market because of the fact that it doesn't necessarily appeal to any one nation or any one currency. Because I feel like a lot of people don't know this, at least on the retail side, but like having cash in your portfolio is very common, and most major investment portfolios have some amount of cash, especially these days. I mean, that some portfolios were getting all the way up to 80-90% cash, and that cash is still a position. Like it is still a position that you are taking
Still
on the
an
market, and most people have it in their domestic currency. I mean, and if you were in the U.S. for the past year, maybe that's a good place to be. If you were in Europe, maybe not. But if you had this option where you don't even have to think about the global economics, it's just like, I want to be in cash, I'm just going to hold Silk.
Yep.
Like that is a really big chunk of the market that Silk appeals to really, really well. And like there's really nothing on the market that does that, or even comes close to it.
And now I guess like the end game would be what, like ultimate sufficient liquidity would come from Silk reaches centralized exchanges too and enters into actual Forex markets, which is like really trippy. I'm not sure how settlement works when there'll never be a single physical Silk in circulation ever. But I do believe one day money will be entirely digital. We're 10 years out from that being the case, and Silk literally could enter into centralized Forex markets. And personally, I want Shadeswap or whatever future branding of Shade Protocol has for its Forex exchange to be the center point of sovereign Forex digital asset exchanges. Like that, and like Silk is at the center of it. And that, I think that market, that TAM is insane. It's a very big TAM. It's serving a lot of people as a service.
And the user story is really nice too, because like if you think about it, if you had an exchange where you had all the Forex pairs and they were all against Silk, you can make a very simple thesis, because in typical Forex, you say, okay, well, I'm going to trade the USD Euro pair, and you have to think about the interaction between those two economies, which is pretty complicated, right? But because of the way Silk is a global index of all the currencies, if you have a thesis that's like, man, Japan's not looking great right now compared to everybody else, I'm going to go enter a position in that pair.
Yep.
All you have to think about is, this country's economy versus everyone else's, rather than these two countries relative to each other, right? So the thesis is very simple, and that like reducing the barrier of entry is, I think, really valuable. And again, it's not something that exists, so it's another segment of the market that's fascinating. We can host really here.
It's essentially like, and that's S&P 500-esque, right? Like just similar analogy of, you could bet against the relationship between a stock and the S&P 500. And it's like, is this company going to outperform or underperform the S&P 500? And the S&P 500 is just a really simplified piece of information that does a great job of aggregating across all the collective value. And it's like, if we can make a currency that maps onto all the global countries, and eventually like we'll add in more things into the basket. We'll add oil, we'll add wheat. We're going to like continue to add in commodities, and it just becomes, to your point, like it simplifies the experiment, and what it represents is, I'm betting that the world, aka Silk, will outpace the euro. Or do I think the euro will outpace the rest of the world, outpace everything else in the basket? And like that makes it simpler to think about. It's not just one country versus another, it's one country versus everything, And my guess is, the interesting part is like Silk wins that battle a lot of the time, which is what makes it so valuable to hold. Because if that's the case, like, why would you bet against it, right? You would hold it. But there's money to be made if it's wrong, and those are markets, that's speculation, that's hedging, that's all those beautiful things that humanity needs when in risk management. So
exactly.
Wow. Well, we went deep really fast. I'm trying to think of we talked about vaults, the different pieces. we talked about liquidity tokens. One question I did have that's come up is like derivatives as collateral. That Mars Protocol is coming to Osmosis, and one of the word on the street with that is derivative tokens introduces, like, at least from the L1 perspective, they're worried about the security risks of derivatives playing a really big part. So I'm just curious at like the role of derivatives in Lend. Do we care about the risks on L1s as we're building out these markets? Is there a balance in there? What's the role of derivatives?
Yeah, this is another interesting question because if you take out the L1 risk, with the L1 risk being essentially if you host a derivative, if your entire supply is a derivative, and you're exposed to that L1, if anything happens with that L1, it affects you as well. And then if all of your supply is in a derivative, there's liquidity questions essentially. But if you strip that out, what the market sees basically is that why would I ever hold Atom or Secret or Osmo if I can hold a liquid staking derivative that is redeemable for that value in the same amount of time? If I stake Secret normally, I have to wait 21 days. If I stake Secret the derivative and I want to take it out at fair market value, I also have to wait 21 days. So there's no disadvantage at all outside of that tail risk to take a derivative. And going back to what I said about how vault demand is based on what people want to borrow against, why would anybody want to borrow against a non-yield bearing position when they can borrow against a yield bearing position with the exact same exposure, right? So if we want to offer Lend vaults in a way that makes sense to the market, I think we have to accept that it's probably going to be staking derivative driven, because that is what makes sense to our borrowers, and that's what makes sense to us. And we do take on a little bit of extra risk, but the additional value that creates for the borrowers, and therefore the additional demand that creates for Silk, in my opinion, is an acceptable trade-off. I don't actually consider the risk of the derivative to be very significant. Even though I guess maybe I should, but
I'm gonna link you a Twitter space after this. There was a Twitter space between Stride and Osmosis, and like, it's so interesting listening to, and I think there's something to be said about being on the app layer. When you don't have to focus on, like, if there was one derivative we'd maybe want to be more careful with, it would be maybe staked Secret, because it impacts the underlying security, and that's kind of their argument, is like, well, ST Osmo is, maybe there needs to be different rules for it because it could impact security, which impacts everything. But just it's interesting food for thought, and I think derivatives are like, they're like the obvious 100x utility, but then like there's the tail risk. And so what is our responsibility as a protocol to that tail risk? It's a question we'll have to explore at some point,
Yeah, I think being transparent about that risk is something that we should do. Just because, like, going back to what I said about demand and everything, we could always offer like a staked Secret vault and a regular S Secret vault. And if someone is really not comfortable with the risk of holding that derivative, then they are free to borrow against the non-yield bearing version of Secret. But and that's a very trivial experiment to run. We could literally just launch 2 vaults and see what happens. But I have a very hard time believing that if you had the option to take a loan and earn 20% APR with your collateral and not earn 20%, you'd probably earn the 20%. You know what I mean? So at very little additional risk, I feel like most people would take that. And if that's what the market wants, that's what we have to give. But within reason, of course. And I think the other thing is that with derivatives, you unlock a lot of interesting portfolio structures, because you have the ability to put up collateral that is yield bearing, borrow money, buy more of that collateral, deposit it, borrow more money, deposit it. You can do that loop, and that's not just strictly degen leverage farming. I mean, you could do that in a very safe way and say, I want 5% of my portfolio to be Secret,
right,
but I really want to capitalize on that yield, so I'm going to keep my exposure limited to 5% of my portfolio, but it's going to be a 3x leverage position, and I'm going to get 3x yield on that 5%, but my max loss is still only 5%. Like, that is a nice position to be in. It's a reasonably safe position, and you can structure that with Lend if you have derivatives. So, that's one really nice way that that we can use Lend that is only possible with the derivatives. So
Amazing. Well, I think this was a really thorough deep dive. I think any community members that really wants to get into the guts and hear about some of these deep forum discussions will super appreciate this. So thank you for your time, Christian. Always a pleasure. I'm sure these types of convos will only continue into perpetuity. But as we approach Shade Lend, Silk Swap, Stable Swap, Bridge, the absurdity of launching all of this, it's just great to peer into the mind of what's going through your head on Lend. So and pretty soon we'll be able to release that demo, which has got some epic music. I don't know if you got to watch it with the music, but it really
I saw
turns
it.
it into something special. And yeah, just excited to get it out there to the world, man. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, I've been waiting for this for a long time. I'm excited.
Awesome. Have a good one, Christian.
Yeah, you too. I'll see you.